There is a moment in certain relationships that can feel more unsettling than rejection. Not when someone misunderstands you, not when someone stays distant, not when you feel unseen, misread, or emotionally alone. Those experiences hurt, of course, but they are often familiar. The psyche knows what to do with them. It knows how to contract, how to protect itself, how to interpret distance as normal, how to keep moving while carrying the ache of not being fully met. But when someone really understands you, something much stranger can happen. You panic, not always in an obvious way, not dramatically. Sometimes so quietly that even you do not realize what is happening until later. Someone sees what you meant without you over-explaining. They notice your deeper feeling before you turn it into something manageable. They understand the pattern you are trapped in, or the fear beneath your behavior, or the thing you were trying to hide even while speaking. And instead of relief, something in you tightens. You may smile. You may even feel moved for a moment. But beneath that warmth, another reaction begins to rise. A sense that this is too close, too accurate, too intimate. Almost as if the person has come near a part of you that is usually protected by distance, by ambiguity, by the comfort of not being fully known. This is what makes the experience so confusing, because consciously, you may have wanted exactly this: to be seen, to be understood, to stop feeling alone in your own interior life. You may have spent years longing for real recognition, real emotional depth, real contact that moves beyond surface language and social performance. And then, when it arrives, part of you begins to retreat. That contradiction is often very painful, because it reveals that your longing for closeness and your fear of closeness are not opposites in the simple sense. They can live inside the same moment. You want to be known, but not too suddenly. You want to be seen, but not in the places where seeing would dismantle the image you are still using to move through the world. You want intimacy, but only if intimacy does not reach certain guarded parts of you before you are ready. This often begins in small relational moments. A friend says something like, "I think you're not really angry. I think you're hurt." A partner notices the exact point where your confidence turns into defense. Someone reads the sadness beneath your humor, or the fear beneath your control, or the loneliness beneath your self-sufficiency. And what they say is not wrong. That is the problem. If they were wrong, you could dismiss them. If they misunderstood, you could stay protected. But when they are right enough to touch something real, the whole interaction changes. You may suddenly become less open, less spontaneous, less warm. You may switch into analysis or make a joke, or redirect a conversation, or become strangely tired, distracted, or emotionally vague. Sometimes you pull away afterward without fully understanding why. Not because the person did something harmful, because they got too close to something you are not used to having witnessed. This can happen in love very intensely. You may long for a deep relationship, for the kind of connection where you no longer have to explain every part of yourself, where someone feels you clearly, where emotional distance finally begins to dissolve. And then one day, someone actually does feel you, not only your charm, not only your pain, not only the polished or narratable parts. They feel the structure beneath you, the hidden sadness, the soft place under the strong one, the fear under the sharpness, the need under the independence. And almost immediately, some part of you begins protecting itself. You become suspicious. You begin scanning for flaws. You start doubting the relationship. You lose ease in the very place where ease should have grown. This creates a very specific kind of emotional confusion, because from the outside, it may look as though you are getting what you wanted, and in a sense, you are, but the psyche is not reacting only to fulfillment of desire. It is reacting to exposure. That exposure is not necessarily sexual, not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily visible to anyone else. It is emotional exposure, the kind that happens when someone begins relating not only to your words, but to your inner organization. That kind of understanding can feel almost invasive, even when it is loving, not because the person is violating you, because your usual protections are no longer working in the same way. You may notice that you are more comfortable around people who do not see too deeply, people with whom you can remain warm, interesting, competent, useful, expressive, but still partially hidden. There is a safety in being only partly known. You can stay in control of what is revealed. You can manage the image. You can maintain enough distance to feel coherent. But deep understanding changes the terms of the relationship. Now, someone is meeting not only what you present, but what lies underneath the presentation. That is where many people begin to feel the old fear. Not always fear of being harmed. Sometimes fear of no longer being able to hide. And hiding, for many psyches, has been a form of stability. This is why being understood can feel so much more destabilizing than being rejected. Rejection hurts, but it leaves the inner structure untouched. You remain hidden, and the old protective arrangement stays intact. Someone else simply remains outside it, but deep understanding comes inside the structure. It illuminates things, and illumination changes the emotional atmosphere immediately. Now, the old self does not know how much concealment is still possible. Now the relationship becomes more real, but also less controllable. Now your private complexities are no longer yours alone. Someone else is standing with them. That may be beautiful. It may also be terrifying. You may begin to recognize that some of your strongest relational patterns are organized around this threshold. You could be close up to a point, vulnerable up to a point, open up to a point. But when someone really starts understanding the deeper logic of your inner world, something in you says, enough, and then a familiar pattern begins. Distance, ambivalence, a sudden need for space, emotional flattening, irritation, restlessness, questions about the relationship that did not exist before. All of this can feel irrational if you only look at the surface. But if you look more honestly, the pattern starts making sense. You are not only afraid of being left, you may be afraid of being fully found. That sounds strange until you feel in yourself. To be found means that someone reaches the places where your loneliness has lived, but also the places where your defenses have lived. It means that your hiddenness stops being total. It means you can no longer rely as completely on selective self-disclosure to manage the distance. That can awaken a very old kind of vulnerability. Because many people do not fear closeness in the abstract. They fear what closeness reveals. They fear the version of themselves that becomes visible when they are no longer half concealed. This may be why certain forms of connection feel easier than others. Intensity can feel easier than understanding. Drama can feel easier than recognition. Longing can feel easier than contact. Why? Because intensity still allows distance. Longing preserves fantasy. Drama keeps movement going without requiring the same kind of emotional stillness that real understanding introduces. But when someone truly gets you, the movement changes. There's nowhere to perform quite as easily, nowhere to hide in the same way, no easy role to retreat into. This is the beginning of the real threshold. Not whether you can survive being misunderstood, but whether you can survive being known. And once that threshold appears, the question changes. It is no longer only, why do I pull away when things get close? It becomes something far more revealing. What in me still experiences emotional understanding as a kind of danger? That is where this journey truly begins. Because once you ask that honestly, you're no longer just talking about romance, attachment, or communication. You are talking about the hidden structure of the self, and the ways it has learned to confuse being deeply seen with losing control. What makes this experience so difficult to understand is that the fear does not come from what most people assume. It does not come only from the possibility of being hurt. It often comes from a possibility of being accurately known. That sounds paradoxical at first, because being known is usually imagined as healing. If someone finally sees you clearly, understands the deeper logic of your feelings, notices the hidden wound beneath the defense, or recognizes a loneliness beneath the strength, shouldn't that bring relief? Sometimes it does. But from a Jungian perspective, relief is not the only thing that deep recognition brings. It also brings exposure. And exposure, especially when it reaches parts of psyche that have been carefully managed or hidden, can feel profoundly destabilizing. Carl Jung would not reduce this to a simple fear of intimacy. He would look more deeply at the structure of the personality and ask what function hiddenness has been serving. He would ask what the ego is protecting by remaining only partially known. He would ask what elements of the self have been split off, held in shadow, or organized behind the persona in such a way that being seen becomes psychologically dangerous. This is where the deeper understanding begins. The persona, as Jung described it, is the social face of the psyche. It is the form through which you become legible to others. It is not inherently deceptive. It is necessary. Without some persona, there is no coherent movement through the collective world. You need some kind of presentation, some kind of interface between your inner complexity and outer life. But the problem begins when the persona becomes too central. Then it is no longer merely a function. It becomes a shelter, a protection, a managed image that allows the ego to remain in relationship without being fully exposed. For many people, the persona is not only about appearing competent or pleasant, it is also about regulating distance. It determines how much of the self can safely enter contact. You may reveal enough to be warm, enough to be interesting, enough to be emotionally intelligent, enough to appear genuine, and yet still remain hidden in the most vulnerable places. That selective openness can feel like intimacy. Often it even looks like intimacy from the outside. But in reality, it may still be heavily organized by control. This is why true understanding can feel so unsettling. Because when someone sees the persona, they are no longer relating only to the version of you that has been consciously curated. They are touching something beneath it, something less defended, less rehearsed, less managed, and for the ego, that can feel dangerous. Not because the other person is necessarily unsafe, because a familiar strategy of self-presentation is no longer enough to control the contact. This is one of the major reasons deep understanding can trigger retreat. The persona has lost its monopoly. The relationship is moving closer to something real. Jung would also point us toward the shadow here. The shadow contains everything the conscious personality has not integrated. This includes traits and feelings that are morally difficult, painful, embarrassing, or threatening to the self-image, but also includes forms of need, softness, dependency, grief, desire, tenderness, and longing that the conscious self may not know how to carry openly. In many people, the parts most deeply in shadow are not only the destructive parts, they are the needy parts, the exposed parts, the parts that never felt safe enough to exist in relationship without shame. So when another person understands you deeply, they may be approaching not only your conscious identity, but your shadowed reality. That is where the panic often begins. Because if someone sees a part of you that still feels small, frightened, dependent, ashamed, lonely, or unguarded, then the old split between what I show and what I hide starts collapsing. And the collapse of that split is not always experienced as liberation first. Often it is experienced as threat. This is why people can be more comfortable with rejection than recognition. Rejection is painful, yes, but rejection leaves the structure of the split intact. You remain hidden. You remain organized. The inner world may ache, but it stays protected. Recognition is different. Recognition crosses the boundary. It says, I see more than you intended to show. And if what is seen includes disowned or shadowed aspects of self, then what you feel loving can also feel unbearable. There is another Jungian dimension here that is essential: projection. Much of ordinary relationship is structured through projection. We see others not only as they are, but as carriers of our own unconscious material. We idealize, fear, diminish, romanticize, or emotionally charge them in ways that tell us as much about ourselves as about them. Projection can create intensity without true knowledge. This is one reason certain relationships feel immediately powerful. They are charged by unconscious meaning. But unconscious intensity is not the same as conscious contact. In fact, many people are far more comfortable with projection than with genuine seeing. Why? Because projection still leaves hiddenness intact. You can be desired without being known. You can be idealized without being understood. You can be pursued without being exposed in your deeper structure. That kind of attention may be unstable, but it does not always threaten the same internal boundaries. Real understanding does, because real understanding withdraws projection and replaces fantasy with contact. Now, the other person is not only loving an image or reacting to your surface. They are perceiving something psychologically accurate, and that psychological accuracy can feel almost invasive if you have lived too long inside careful self-concealment. Jung knew that true relationship always changes the psyche. His image of two personalities meeting like chemical substances is important here. If there's any real contact, both are transformed. That is the deeper fear in some people. Not simply being seen, but being altered by being seen. Because once someone truly understands you, the relationship is no longer built only on your terms. It can affect you in places you do not fully control. This is why some people prefer longing to intimacy. Longing is painful, but it preserves self-enclosure. You can ache for someone and still remain fundamentally organized around yourself. True closeness rearranges things. It makes demands. It reveals. It softens defenses you did not know were still structuring your life. And if the ego has learned to equate structure with safety, then that softening can feel threatening even while it is healing. There is also a complex around understanding itself in many people. If, earlier in life, being known led to intrusion, ridicule, emotional exploitation, overexposure, or the loss of personal boundaries, then understanding becomes linked not with comfort, but with vulnerability. Someone getting you no longer means warmth and rest. It may mean danger. It may mean they now have access. And access, in such a psyche, may be associated with loss of control. This is why the body often reacts before the mind does. A person says something deeply accurate, and before you can consciously process it, your nervous system has already tightened. Maybe you go slightly cold. Maybe your tone changes. Maybe you become analytical. Maybe you suddenly feel tired. These reactions can seem random if you do not understand them, but they often reflect the activation of a complex. The psyche is saying, too close, not because the person is wrong, because accuracy itself has become charged. Jung would not say the answer is to force openness blindly. He never argued for indiscriminate vulnerability. The psyche needs discernment, timing, and boundaries. But he would insist that if being understood consistently feels more threatening than being misread, then something important is split off in the personality. Usually, that split concerns control. When you are misunderstood, you can still maintain control in a strange way. You may feel hurt, but you remain internally separate. The other person has not touched the more hidden, living, dangerous places. But when they do understand, control shifts. The relationship can now move in a more truthful direction, and truth requires more from you than distance ever did. It may require honesty, reciprocity, emotional surrender, the letting go of roles, the admitting of need, the acceptance that another person now carries real knowledge of you. That can feel like a loss of psychic territory. And because the old self was built around protecting that territory, it reacts defensively. This is why the pattern often appears right at the moment where a relationship could become real. Everything feels good until the other person sees too much. Then distance returns. Ambivalence enters. The psyche begins restoring uncertainty because uncertainty creates space, and space restores control. From a Jungian perspective, this is not random sabotage. It is the old self attempting to preserve an arrangement in which intimacy can be approached but not fully entered. The deeper work, then, is not simply learn to trust. It is to understand what trust would threaten. What would have to loosen in you if another person could truly know you and still remain? What defenses would no longer be necessary? What persona would become thinner? What shadowed parts would have to be admitted into relationship? Those are the real questions. Because once you see that being understood threatens more than your comfort, it threatens a whole structure of identity organized around selective visibility, then the retreat finally becomes intelligible. You are not only afraid of closeness, you are afraid of what closeness would dismantle. And until that is understood, emotional recognition will continue feeling less like rescue and more like danger. That is the threshold you are approaching, not just the threshold of intimacy. The threshold where your old way of protecting yourself no longer survives being seen clearly. A different kind of work begins the moment you stop treating your retreat as final truth. That is the real turning point here. Because for a long time, the pattern may have felt self-explanatory. Someone gets close, really close, and something in you pulls back. So you assume the connection must be wrong. Too intense. Too fast. Too complicated. You tell yourself you need space, more clarity, less pressure, more time. And sometimes that may be true, but not always. Sometimes what is happening is much more psychologically precise than simple incompatibility. Sometimes the connection becomes difficult the moment it becomes real enough to threaten your old defenses. That means the task is no longer only to ask, is this relationship right or wrong? The deeper task becomes, what is being activated in me when I am accurately seen? That question changes everything. Because once you ask it honestly, you stop reducing the whole experience to chemistry, timing, or mixed signals. You begin noticing the structure of your own retreat. You begin seeing that the discomfort is not only about the other person. It is about what happens inside you when your hidden parts stop being hidden in the same way. This is where integration begins. Not by forcing yourself to stay close no matter what. Not by overriding every instinct for distance. But by becoming conscious enough to distinguish between genuine danger and the old fear of exposure. That distinction is one of the hardest in emotional life, because exposure and danger can feel identical in the body, even when they're not the same thing. Someone understands you, and your nervous system reacts. Your chest tightens. Your words get smaller. You feel the urge to redirect, soften, disappear, joke, intellectualize, or move the interaction back towards safer ground. Before, that reaction may have been automatic. Now, the work is to notice it, not judge it. Notice it. You begin to see the moment the old structure starts reassembling itself. The exact second when something in you says, this is too much. They see too much. I need distance. That moment matters. Because if you can stay conscious there, even briefly, the whole pattern starts loosening. Jung's psychology always returns to this principle. What is unconscious governs you absolutely, but what becomes conscious can be related to. You do not need to become instantly unafraid. You need to stop becoming fully possessed by the fear before you even know what it is doing. So the first movement of integration is surprisingly small. You remain, maybe only inwardly at first. Someone says something accurate about you, something that touches a deeper truth, and instead of immediately protecting yourself by changing the subject or emotionally disappearing, you stay in contact with what you feel. Embarrassment, perhaps, tension, the urge to hide, the sense of being too open, too visible, too close to something you usually keep under control. You let those feelings exist without immediately acting from them. That is not passive. It is a profound psychological act. Because it means you are no longer treating the old reaction as unquestionable law. You are beginning to develop another position inside yourself, a witnessing position, one that can say, yes, I feel the need to retreat. And no, I do not have to obey it instantly. This creates a new kind of room, and room is what the old pattern has never had. The old pattern runs on speed. Recognition happens. Anxiety rises. Retreat follows. So quickly that the psyche never has to discover whether deeper contact might actually be survivable. But if you slow it down, something else becomes possible. You begin asking, what exactly feels dangerous here? The answer will not always be the same. Sometimes it is the danger of needing. If someone understands you deeply, then the relationship can become a place of real nourishment. And if nourishment becomes possible, need becomes harder to deny. For people whose identity has long been organized around self-sufficiency, that is deeply destabilizing. It is easier to remain fine at a distance than to be genuinely touched and then discover how much you want more. Sometimes the danger is the loss of image. If someone sees the fear beneath your strength, the tenderness beneath your intelligence, the loneliness beneath your independence, then the persona you have relied on becomes less absolute. That can feel like exposure, not because you're being harmed, but because you're no longer fully protected by the role you know how to inhabit. Sometimes the danger is emotional responsibility. Once someone really understands you, the relationship becomes more real. It is no longer built only on projection, mystery, intensity, or indirect longing. Now there is truth in the room, and truth asks for response. It asks for honesty, for reciprocity, for a level of emotional participation that may feel far more demanding than fantasy ever did. And sometimes the danger is grief, because being truly seen often reveals how long you have lived unseen, even by yourself. It highlights the distance you have kept from your own softer places. It reveals how much of your life has been organized around concealment. That realization can be painful enough that retreat feels easier than staying in contact with what the recognition awakens. This is why integration takes patience. You are not simply learning to accept intimacy. You are learning how to let another person's accuracy coexist with your own fear without allowing the fear to immediately destroy the contact. This can begin in very modest ways. You do not have to reveal everything. You do not have to suddenly become emotionally transparent. You begin by not undoing every real moment the second it happens. Someone understands you, and you do not instantly turn the interaction into a joke. Someone sees your vulnerability, and you do not immediately perform competence over it. Someone names something true, and instead of becoming cold or distant, you allow the truth to stay in a room for a moment longer than usual. Those moments may seem almost invisible from the outside. Internally, they are enormous, because the old pattern depended on immediate concealment. Now, concealment is no longer automatic. This is how trust actually forms, not as a feeling first, as an experience. You stay in a moment of being seen, and you survive it. You let someone understand something real, and you do not disappear afterward. You allow accurate contact, and the world does not collapse. That is how the psyche learns a new law. Not all recognition is intrusion. Not all understanding is danger. Not all closeness leads to loss of self. These truths cannot be learned abstractly. They have to be lived, repeatedly, and as they are lived, your relationship to yourself begins changing too. You may begin noticing that what frightened you most was not the other person's understanding, but your own lack of permission to be known in that place. In other words, the outer recognition only triggered the inner division that was already there. Part of you was visible. Another part still felt forbidden. As long as that division remains severe, intimacy will keep feeling unstable. So the deeper work is not only relational, it is intrapsychic. You begin reclaiming the parts of yourself that have felt too soft, too needy, too ashamed, too dependent, too unguarded to be included in your identity. The more those parts become conscious, the less threatening it becomes when someone else sees them too. This is where Jung's idea of wholeness becomes essential. Wholeness does not mean perfect self-disclosure. It means less division, less need to keep entire regions of the self exiled from relationship, less terror that accurate contact will destroy your structure. The more whole you become, the less you need the persona to do all the work protection, and the less you need to flee every time another human being comes near the truth of who you are. That does not mean you stop discerning. Discernment remains crucial. Not everyone who understands you is actually safe. Not every penetrating insight is loving. Some people do invade, interpret, control, or use knowledge destructively. Jung would never ask you to ignore that reality. But real discernment is different from generalized retreat. Real discernment says, I can tell the difference between being seen with care and being exposed without reverence. That difference matters. Because only once you can tell the difference do you stop treating all emotional accuracy as danger. Then the relationship can finally become what it was trying to become all along. Not a place where you perform being known, but a place where more of you can actually exist. This is where the deeper stability appears. Not the stability of distance. A new stability. The stability of remaining yourself while being understood. You no longer need every accurate perception to trigger withdrawal. You no longer need mystery, confusion, or emotional fog in order to feel safe. You begin discovering that closeness does not have to annihilate you. It may rearrange you. It may soften you. It may make old defenses obsolete. But that is not the same as destruction. It may be the beginning of a more truthful life in relationship. And once you begin to trust that, even a little, the old pattern starts losing its inevitability. You can still feel fear. You can still want to run, and still stay. That is the new movement, not fearlessness. Something more mature than that. The willingness to let yourself remain in contact, even when someone sees you more deeply than the old self knows how to manage. That is what makes real intimacy possible, not the absence of exposure. The ability to stop abandoning yourself the moment exposure becomes real. And that changes everything. Because once you can stay, understanding is no longer only a threat. It becomes what it was always capable of being. a place where the hidden parts of you finally do not have to live alone. What makes this kind of pain so confusing is that it does not look like fear at first. It can look like loss of interest, like sudden distance, like needing space, like emotional confusion that appears right when closeness should be becoming easier. From the outside, even to yourself, it may seem as though something just changed. But if you look more carefully, something else becomes visible. What changed was not always a relationship. Sometimes what changed was the depth of recognition. Someone came close enough to see you more clearly than your usual defenses allow. And that is when the old structure reacted. Carl Jung would have understood this immediately. He knew that the psyche does not only fear pain, it also fears revelation, especially the kind of revelation that makes old protections less effective. You may have spent years believing that what you wanted most was to be understood. And in one sense, that is true. Human beings long to be known, to be met, to be recognized without having to explain every hidden corner of themselves. But another truth can exist at the same time. Part of you may have built an entire identity around controlling how much of you is knowable, not because you are dishonest, because hiddenness became safety. Selective visibility became coherence. Distance became structure. And once that structure is touched by real understanding, the psyche can react as if something dangerous is happening. That does not mean your desire for intimacy was false. It means intimacy is asking more from you than longing ever did. Longing lets you remain inwardly protected. Fantasy lets you imagine closeness without being changed by it. Real understanding is different. It enters the structure. It illuminates what was concealed. It softens a persona. It approaches the shadow. And once that happens, the old self no longer feels fully in control of what is being revealed. That is why recognition can feel more threatening than rejection. Rejection hurts, but it keeps the hidden self hidden. Recognition asks whether the hidden self can survive in relationship. That is the real threshold. Not whether someone else can understand you, whether you can tolerate being understood without immediately retreating into the old forms of protection. This is why the pattern deserves compassion, not shame. You are not broken because closeness scares you. You are confronting a very old organization of selfhood, one that may have learned, for good reasons once, that exposure was costly, that being known could lead to intrusion, disappointment, humiliation, control, or the loss of inner territory. If that is what the psyche learned, then of course deep understanding feels charged. Of course, it does not immediately register as safe. But Jung's path was never about staying organized around old fear forever. It was about making those hidden structures conscious enough that they stop ruling your life from underneath. That is what this whole process is asking of you. Not instant openness. Not reckless vulnerability. Something more honest and more difficult than that. The willingness to notice when your old defenses are being activated by real contact, and not automatically hand them the final decision. Because the truth is, not every person who sees you deeply is safe. That is real. To some it matters. But it is equally true that not every urge to withdraw is wisdom. Sometimes it is history. Sometimes it is the old self defending the old arrangement. Sometimes it is a part of you that still confuses being deeply seen with losing control. Before we close, sit with one question. Think of a moment when someone understood you more deeply than you expected. What happened in you immediately afterward? Did you feel warmth, distance, embarrassment, the urge to disappear, suspicion, a need to restore emotional space? Do not judge the answer. Just see it clearly. Because whatever rose first is pointing toward the exact place where intimacy still touches an old wound. If this resonates, write in the comments one sign you notice in yourself when someone gets emotionally too close. Not the polished answer. The real one. The first reaction. And if you know someone who longs for a deep connection but keeps pulling away the moment someone truly sees them, you may share this video with them. Because sometimes the deepest fear is not being unloved. It is that if love finally reaches the hidden parts, the old self will no longer be able to survive behind the places it used to hide. And yet, that may also be where real healing begins. See you in the next video.